know, I'm quite a fan of the potential benefits of the Western Rail access to Heathrow, and potentially it could unlock more growth and opportunities across the Great areas served by Great Western. And regular representations are made, and I'm sure the Chancellor, who's now on the bench, will have heard those he's just made.
Well done. Chris Elmore!
The reality is, with Ford, with the potential closures, 1,700 jobs gone, between 6,000 and 7,000 in the supply chain. It's no good the Secretary of State saying manufacturing is buoyant with all these potential job closures coming. We need economic stimulus packages from the UK government in support of Welsh Government. What is the Minister going to do about it to protect these jobs?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, the Government's active in terms of ensuring there is economic development in Wales, but I would say the honourable member opposite might wish to reflect on what was said by a Welsh Government Minister yesterday in relation to how they know about what's going on.
Finally, Carol Monaghan.
Mr Speaker, number 14.
50. Thank you, Mr Speaker. The UK Government's extensive network of diplomatic staff regularly provides support to the Welsh ministers for overseas visit relating to devolved matters. However, we will not support activities intended to undermine the United Kingdom.
Carol Monaghan.
Mr Speaker, earlier this month, the Foreign Office blocked diplomatic assistance to First Ministers of Wales and Scotland. In light of this action, which was an affront to our democratically elected First Ministers, can the Secretary of State explain how this United Kingdom is a partner of equals?
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. We will always provide the extensive network of FCO posts abroad and the offices of the Department of International Trade to support those representations from devolved areas. But what we will do is we will be a platform for the success of Wales, not for separatism in Scotland.
Congratulate the honourable gentleman, who I think is proudly sporting a free Nazanin badge, accompanied by many colleagues on that matter, I think. Mr Ian C. Lucas.
I've received excellent support from the diplomatic service abroad when I was the Shadow Middle East Minister. Can I commend the diplomatic service working closely with all elected members of Parliament and of assemblies and of the Scottish Parliament to preserve the integrity and strength of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm pleased to hear the honourable member's experience, and as I said before, we will always look to provide support to promote the success of Wales and the success of this United Kingdom. What we won't do is look to undermine it.
Thank you. Order. Questions to the Prime Minister. Thangham Debonair.
Question number 1, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm sure that the whole House will want to join me in wishing the England football team the very best for their game against Norway tomorrow. Mr Speaker, this morning my office hosted a reception to mark Armed Forces Reserves Day, and this coming Saturday we celebrate Armed Forces Day. This is an opportunity for us all to pay tribute to our servicemen and women here and around the world for their dedication and service, and to those who have served in previous generations. Mr Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. Later today, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, and I will travel to Japan for the G20 Leaders Summit. With the threat of climate change putting future generations at risk, vile terrorist propaganda continuing to spread online, and rising tensions in the Gulf, this summit is an opportunity to address global challenges affecting all our nations.
Thangham Debonair.
As the thousands of people demonstrating outside will tell you, tackling climate change and biodiversity makes the world safer, more beautiful and sustainable for our children and grandchildren. Does the Prime Minister agree that one of the first acts of the next Prime Minister should be, urgently, a new Environment and Climate Change Bill, putting into place all the recommendations of the Committee on Climate Change to meet net carbon zero, making the world a more beautiful place?
Can I say to the honourable lady that we are introducing an environment bill as a government. We've introduced a 25-year environment plan. I think for the first time that any government has done that. We've committed to net zero emissions by 2050. That has gone through this House. But the question she needs to think about is, why is the Labour Party in the House of Lords trying to block the net zero in 2050 legislation?
Julian Sturdy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the biggest restraints on what is a very positive economy in York and North Yorkshire is the lack of progress on devolution. Following the rejection of the One Yorkshire proposal, does the Prime Minister agree with me that we need to have a more local approach, such as a York and North Yorkshire deal, to rival those of the big urban centres?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend, I absolutely recognise, as we do across government, the enthusiasm and dedication in Yorkshire for devolution and the potential seen there for harnessing local people's sense of identity with Yorkshire, and we share the ambition of doing what is best for Yorkshire, its people and its businesses. My right honourable friend, the Communities Secretary, has now met with Yorkshire leaders. Discussions are continuing about a different localist approach to devolution, and officials are having initial meetings with councils, including York, and will be interested in hearing their ambitions for devolution.
Jeremy Corbyn!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope the whole House will welcome today's mass climate lobby that's coming to Parliament today. And we should be proud of it. This House, after all, became the first Parliament in the world to declare a climate emergency. Yeah. And I want to pay tribute to the young people and young climate strikers that have done so much to raise awareness of this issue. And I hope members will take the chance today to meet those that are coming to lobby and learn from them, because they feel very passionately on the issue. I also acknowledge it's Armed Forces Day and the celebrations are going on this week, and I think we should be concerned about the welfare of both serving and former serving members of our armed forces. And I join the Prime Minister in congratulating the Lionesses for reaching the quarter-finals of the Women's World Cup and wish them well tomorrow night against Norway. Mr. Speaker, I welcome the judgment of the Court of Appeal last Thursday against UK arms sales to Saudi Arabia. The court found that the government had, and I quote, made no concluded assessments of whether the Saudi-led coalition had committed violations of international humanitarian law during the Yemen conflict and made no attempt to do so. Does the Prime Minister dispute that finding?
Here we go.
We continue to operate one of the most robust arms export control regimes in the world, and we take our responsibilities on arms export licensing very seriously. Indeed, in the words of the 2017 judgment, the government engaged in anxious scrutiny, indeed at what seems like anguished scrutiny at some stages. We're disappointed that the court found against the government on one ground, and we will be seeking permission to appeal this judgment.
Jeremy Corbyn!
Mr. Speaker, Germany, as an EU member state, has banned arms exports to Saudi Arabia. So has Denmark, and both the US Senate and House of Representatives have voted to ban arms exports as well. The UN describes the situation in Yemen as, and I quote, humanity's biggest preventable disaster, and the government sees fit to continue selling arms to Saudi Arabia during that situation. So can I ask the Prime Minister a very simple question? Does she believe there are serious ongoing violations of international humanitarian law by Saudi Arabia in Yemen? Yes or no?
Yes. The right honourable gentleman knows very well that we consider these issues very carefully when we are dealing with these arms export licences, as has just been quoted by the court. But he references the situation in Yemen. This cannot go on. We need a political settlement in Yemen. I would remind the right honourable gentleman that the Saudi-led intervention was at the request of the legitimate president of the Yemen, following a rebel insurgency which overthrew the internationally recognised government, and the intervention has been acknowledged by the United Nations. Now, my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, held a Yemen Quad meeting on Saturday, expressing concerns at escalating tensions. But what do we see the Labour Party do? One of his MPs was inviting rebel leaders of the insurgency into the House of Commons. Yet again, Labour on the wrong side of the argument.
Jeremy Corbyn!
The Prime Minister doesn't appear to understand the depth of feeling at the UN, parliaments around the world, and even the US Senate and House on this situation. The UN itself has warned that by the end of 2019, if the war continues, 230,000 people would have lost their lives, 140,000 of which are children under the age of 5. The UK and EU law states that the government must, and I quote, not grant a licence if there is a clear risk that the items used might be used in the commission of a serious violation of international humanitarian law. The government said they'd used the following criteria to judge that, and I quote, an understanding of Saudi military procedures, continuing engagement with the Saudis at the highest level, and Saudi public commitments to international humanitarian law. So if the Saudi government says they're respecting human rights, do we then ignore all evidence on the ground in Yemen and continue to sell weapons to this regime, which has led to this appalling death toll already in this conflict?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, first of all, as I've made clear, we're seeking permission to appeal the recent judgment. But the judgment isn't about whether the government made the right or wrong decisions, but about the decision-making process and whether it was rational. So we are considering the implications of the judgment alongside the permission to appeal that we're seeking. And while we do this, we won't grant any new licences for exports to Saudi Arabia and its coalition partners, which might be used in the conflict in Yemen. But he talks about the conflict in Yemen. As I've just said, let's remember what happened, why we are seeing this conflict in Yemen. It was the overthrow of the internationally recognised government by rebel insurgents. We are all concerned. We are all concerned. We are all concerned about the humanitarian situation in Yemen. That is, the Shadow Foreign Secretary might like, actually, as this is an area of concern to her, remit, to actually listen to what the government is doing.
Order. Order. The questions must be heard and the answers must be heard. The Prime Minister.
We are all concerned about the humanitarian situation in the Yemen. That is why, since the start of the conflict in 2015, our total commitment to Yemen, it now stands at £770 million. We are one of the major contributors to support for the humanitarian effort. Ultimately, the only way to resolve this issue is through a political settlement, and that is why we are supporting the efforts of the UN Special Envoy Martin Griffiths.
Corbyn!
If that's the case, why is the government appealing the judgment instead of promoting a peace settlement in Yemen? Since 2016, Mr. Speaker, for 3 years, United Nations experts have been saying that the Saudi coalition has violated international humanitarian law in Yemen. This air campaign has killed tens of thousands and injured and displaced many more. The government says there can be no military solution to this particular conflict. There can only be a negotiated and political solution. If that is the case, why have they pumped £4.6 billion of military equipment into this brutal bombardment already?
I say to the right honourable gentleman, what we do believe, as I've just said, I've said in answer to his last question, I said it, I think, in answer to the first question that he gave me, that the only way to ensure the security and stability of Yemen for the future is through a political settlement. That is why this government is supporting the work that is being done by the UN Special Envoy Martin Griffiths. That is why we are continuing to use our diplomatic efforts, including, as I said, the Foreign Secretary holding a Yemen Quad on Saturday, to encourage others around the table. We are very clear. We support the efforts to secure the agreement by the parties to the conflict to implement the Stockholm Agreements. That is an important part of the process leading to peace and a political solution. We need to ensure that work is essential so that progress can be made at the next round of peace talks and so that humanitarian supply lines can be opened up.
Jeremy Corbyn.
It was her Trade Secretary who said there couldn't be a military solution to this conflict. Surely the government should think on this and stop the sale of arms to Saudi Arabia. Just last week, the UN Special Rapporteur, Agnes Kalamard, said there is credible evidence that the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and other high-level officials are personally responsible for the horrific murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Does the Prime Minister accept that assessment?
I say to the right honourable gentleman, We do want to see accountability for this horrific murder. I raised the death of Jamal Khashoggi with King Salman at the Sharm summit. That's the second time I've done so. I've raised it with the Crown Prince at the G20 last year. I've stressed the importance of those responsible being held to account, of due process being followed. We expect Saudi Arabia to take the action necessary to ensure such violations of international and national laws can't happen again. The right direction, the right way to take this is through a judicial process, and we're obviously closely following the continuing investigation. We expect it to proceed in line with internationally recognised legal standards.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, there is overwhelming evidence that war crimes have been committed in Yemen by Saudi Arabian forces. A state that flouts every human rights norm at home and abroad. Its government believes that it can kill with impunity journalists or civil rights campaigners, Yemenis or Bahrainis. It funds extremism around the world. But the UK has supplied them with over £4.5 billion worth of deadly weapons. UK weapons which have been used in indiscriminate attacks on civilians in which over 200,000 people have been killed. And hundreds of thousands more stand on the brink of famine, of starvation and of death from wholly preventable diseases. Surely, Mr. Speaker, the Court of Appeal judgment should be a wake-up call to the Prime Minister and the Government. So instead of appealing the judgment, why not accept the judgment and stop arms sales to Saudi Arabia now and bring about peace in the Yemen and save those lives?
The right honourable gentleman says to me, bring about peace in the Yemen. It's exactly what we are working with our international partners to do through the United Nations and through the Yemen Quad. But also the right honourable gentleman is talking about the relations that we have with Saudi Arabia. That is a relationship that has saved lives of British citizens in the past. But let's just look at some of the relationships that the right honourable gentleman supports. When people were killed in Salisbury, his sympathies were with Russia. When terrorists were killing our people, his sympathies were with the IRA. And in the recent tanker attacks in the Gulf, his sympathies were with Iran. He never backs Britain, and he should never be Prime Minister.
Mr. Bradley.
I'm a firm believer that youth work is part of the answer to so many issues in our society and has a huge role to play in my Mansfield constituency, but currently we're at risk of losing vital youth work qualifications. The review of these qualifications was announced on April the 1st, but the funding has been delayed in the system. If it's not secured, we're in danger of seeing universities and colleges drop these qualifications from 2020. So will my right honourable friend ensure that this funding is signed off immediately so we can continue to train amazing youth workers?
Well, my honourable friend has raised an important issue and the importance of the proper training of these youth workers. We are absolutely committed to properly qualified and trained youth sector. Subject to a business case, we have committed to renewing funding for these qualifications and reviewing the youth work curriculum. I know DCMS are in very close contact with the National Youth Agency and aware of the timing issues and hope to make an announcement on this in the near future.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister with our reservists? I am happy today to be supporting a badge on supporting Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, and I hope in the days that the Prime Minister has left in office she will do what she can to secure the release of Nazin from jail in Iran. And I hope the Prime Minister will join many of us outside Parliament today in support of the climate justice activists. And I have to say to the Leader of the Opposition that it was the Scottish Government that was the first government in the UK to declare a climate emergency. And I hope that the UK responds to the leadership that Scotland is giving on this issue. Mr. Speaker, do or die, come what may. Those are the words of the Prime Minister's likely successor. The truth behind the Brexit chaos in the Tory party is encompassed in those words. The Tory dream is to drag us out of the European Union, no matter what the cost. Prime Minister, before you exit office, will you pledge to never vote for a successor willing to impose a devastating no-deal Brexit on all of us?
Well, I have to remind the right honourable gentleman yet again that he is due to ask me questions about my responsibilities as Prime Minister. And I would remind him yet again that as Prime Minister, I voted 3 times in this House to ensure that we could take the UK out of the European Union with a deal that was good for the whole of the United Kingdom, and he voted effectively for no deal.
Ian Blackford.
My goodness, it's no wonder she's leaving. That was no answer to a question. The Prime Minister is showing gross cowardice. On the one hand, the Tories are asking people to put their faith in the most incompetent Foreign Secretary in a century. A man who has made a career out of lying, who has spent his week avoiding the media, staging photos and playing to the extreme delusions of the Tory shires. On the other hand, we have the most incompetent Health Secretary in our history. A man who writes books on privatising our NHS. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives clearly don't like the truth. Someone so desperate for a chance at his 30-year Downing Street fantasy that he's...
I think the right honourable gentleman's concluded his inquiry. Well, if he... Order! If he hasn't, he needs to do so in a single sentence. Order! Mr. Cowan, I'm sure you're a well-intentioned fellow, but I require no counsel from you. One sentence. We've got a lot of questions to get through. A sentence. Well done. Mr. Blackford.
Mr. Speaker, in her last days in office, will she finally act in the best interest of these islands, not the Conservative Party, and admit that neither of the candidates for office should ever be elected Prime Minister?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, either of the candidates for this high office would do a darn sight better job than anybody sitting on any of those benches.
Seldom have I had such a welcome in this House, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome the announcements that the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions made yesterday. Would my right honourable friend update the House about some of those plans and how she feels that they will enable more people living with disabilities and health conditions to play their full part in our society?
Well, can I first of all thank my honourable friend for the work that she did as Minister for Disabled People, which sets a lot of the groundwork for the announcement we've been able to make on the disability strategy. There are many disabled people in our society who would love to actually be able to get into the workplace. One of the key issues underpinning that strategy is support for people to enable them to take their full role in society, to get into the workplace, to ensure they have access to the support that they need. I'm very proud of the fact that something like 950,000 more disabled people are now in the workplace, thanks to the actions of Conservatives in government. There is more for us to do. The disability strategy sets our path to do that and enable disabled people to play their full role in our society.
Caroline Flint.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Almost every infrastructure project across the UK requires British-made steel. The contracts for the next 5 years alone are worth £1 billion. But yesterday, UK Steel and Community Trade Union members were asking me if the Scunthorpe Steelworks will still be working in 5 days' time. Will the Prime Minister guarantee that a month from now, before she leaves office, the Scunthorpe Steelworks will still be open?
Well, can I say to the right honourable lady, we are concerned about the situation in relation to the Scunthorpe Works, in relation to British Steel. That's why my right honourable friend, the Business Secretary, is engaging actively with the official receiver. Obviously, the official receiver has a responsibility in relation to this matter, but we are doing all that we can as a government. And I was pleased to meet with, obviously, as she knows, a number number of members of Parliament who have still interests in their constituencies to talk about the real impact that the closure of the works would have on people. That's why we're working so actively to try to ensure that we can retain employment in that area.
Suella Braverman.
Mr. Speaker, I'm due to give birth any day now. I'm hoping there won't be an emergency in the Commons. But can I just put on record my thanks to you, the former Leader of the House, this Government and cross-party MPs who have delivered the proxy voting scheme, which will enable my constituents to be represented during my maternity leave. Mr. Speaker, 11-year-old Ruby Lloyd from Hook with Warsash Primary School is campaigning for a pedestrian crossing on Warsash Road to encourage more pupils to walk to school, thereby improving road safety and air quality. Hundreds of local residents support her campaign, her headmistress supports her campaign, and so do her councillors. Will my right honourable friend get behind Ruby's campaign for safer roads in Fairham?
Can I first of all say to my honourable friend that we wish her the very best for the upcoming birth? And can I also say that I have a certain satisfaction, having played a little role in ensuring that she and her husband actually got married, as she acknowledges. Can I say on the issue that she has referred to of Ruby? First of all, it's very good to see young people caring passionately about their local area and campaigning for their local area. And it's vital, obviously, that children can go to school in a safe environment. Of course, this is an issue for the local authority, but I would just like to wish Ruby the very best for her campaign.
Nick Thomas-Symonds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Universal credit is causing great hardship in my constituency. It is driving up debt, it is increasing food bank use, it is making people who are out of work worse off and people who are in work worse off. In her final weeks in office, will she act to halt the rollout of this failed policy, or will she simply leave this injustice burning?
I just say to the honourable gentleman, what lay behind universal credit was changing our benefit system. The legacy system we inherited from the Labour Party was one where over 1 million people were left on benefits for nearly a decade. What universal credit does is helps people into work and ensures that when they are in work, they are able to earn more. 200,000 more people in work. 1 million disabled people getting more money as a result of universal credit. 700,000 people getting the benefits they are entitled to as a result of universal credit. This is a policy that is working.
Paul Masterton.
Speaker, I know we're coming up to one of your favourite times of the year with Wimbledon starting next week, and many members have already been enjoying hitting a few balls on the court in New Palace Yard. So will my right honourable friend take this opportunity to wish all the British players the best of luck in the championships, and also welcome the announcement from the Lawn Tennis Association of £250 million for 96 new indoor tennis centres to open up the sport to 3 million more people across the UK.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for in a very timely fashion raising this issue. I certainly wish all the very best to all the British players who will be participating in Wimbledon. I'd like to congratulate Andy Murray for his win in the doubles at Queen's at the weekend. I understand that there is an exhibition of tennis taking place here in Parliament today with the Paddock School from Putney taking part in that, and it's very good to see young people having that experience and having that opportunity, and I welcome the LTA, the fact that the LTA is directing funding across the whole country to where it's needed most to grow the sport from the grassroots up.
Mr. Khalid Mahmood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A recent YouGov poll into Islamophobia within the Conservative Party shows an astounding level of racism. Almost 50% polled would not want to see a Muslim Prime Minister. Only 8% would be proud if there was one. 67% believe racist myths about Muslim communities, and yet 8 out of 10 don't think this is a problem. In light of this, and as one of her final acts of her premiership, will the Prime Minister finally agree to commission an external inquiry into Islamophobia within her increasingly nasty party?
I say to the honourable gentleman, we take any allegations of Islamophobia very seriously in the Conservative Party. Every allegation is properly investigated. We have seen my right honourable friend, the chairman of the Conservative Party, take swift action. We have seen people suspended from the party. We have seen people excluded from the party. And I would just say to the honourable gentleman that it is in direct contrast to the way in which the Labour Party deals with anti-Semitism. Indeed, Indeed, it is easier to be kicked out of the Labour Party for voting Liberal Democrat than for being anti-Semitic.
Alistair Burt!
Speaker, there is a risk that complex conflicts thousands of miles away can sometimes appear deceptively simple at Westminster. Does my right honourable friend share my surprise that the Leader of the Opposition did not mention the Human Rights Watch had said last week that it was a potential war crime of Houthi drones targeting civilian targets in Saudi Arabia? And the World Food Programme has recently suspended aid in Houthi-controlled areas because of its diversion, aid workers not being allowed into Houthi areas, and aid being diverted to enrich Houthi forces. Is it not the case that it's best to recognise the horrors of war on all sides and concentrate not on being one-sided, but getting fully behind the tireless efforts of Martin Griffiths to seek peace in Yemen and support those efforts and bring this conflict to an end?
Can I thank my right honourable friend with his experience in the Foreign Office? He has seen and knows the complexities of these issues, and he's absolutely right that it is important that we look at what is happening in the Yemen and we recognise the actions that the Houthis have been taking as well. That is why it is so important to bring both sides around the table to ensure that we can get that agreed peace settlement and find supporting Martin Griffiths, the UN Special Envoy, in his efforts to bring the parties around the table. And he references the humanitarian aid. I said earlier the extent of humanitarian aid we've given. One of the great problems we've had to address is the way in which it is not always possible to get that aid to the people who need it most. Not because of our inability, because of the insurgents, the way in which the Houthis are preventing that aid getting to the people who need it most.
Aaron Lee!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Brexit uncertainty is hitting manufacturing businesses in my Lincoln constituency, and local managing directors have told me that no deal would be absolutely catastrophic for them, for their exports to Europe, and it will put local jobs at risk. One firm has even put workers on short-time working already, temporarily. Does the Prime Minister accept that her government, and I include in this statement either of her likely successors, have made a catastrophic no-deal Brexit a more likely outcome?
I wanted to deliver Brexit with a deal. I brought a deal to this House, and the Honourable Lady and her colleagues voted 3 times against that deal.
Andrew Griffiths!
On Monday, 160 years of food production on the same site in Burton ended with the announcement of the closure of the Kerry food plant in my constituency, affecting 900 jobs in both Burton and in the constituency of my friend from South Derbyshire. The Prime Minister will obviously have great sympathy for all of those workers who are concerned about their future, concerned about paying their mortgage, the holidays they have booked, and their families. Will she commit to a cross-department task force to try and help ensure we not only get those 900 people back into work, but we find a new use for that plant in Burton?
Yes. Well, obviously, as my honourable friend says, I'm sure this is going to be a very worrying time for the employees of Kerry Foods and their families. I understand that ministers from the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy are speaking to my honourable friend to discuss the situation, and they will work with DEFRA and with housing communities and local government to explore the various options. We'll also want to work closely with businesses and local partners to ensure those affected are well supported, and indeed to explore options for the future of the site. And our thoughts are with those who will obviously be very concerned at this time.
Jay Stevens.
Mr. Speaker, 7-year-old Talia Balade, who's the daughter of my constituent Gosia Simanovic, was abducted by her father and taken to Libya in 2012. The father returned here without Talia, and she remains in Libya with his mother. He was jailed but released on licence in 2017, and he's now absconded and is not reporting to the Home Office. All Gosha's legal avenues have been exhausted, and she is really desperate. Will the Prime Minister please use every channel available during her final weeks in office to secure Talia's return to her mother in the UK?
I say to the Honourable Lady, obviously she's outlined this case here in the House. I will ensure that this is a matter that is looked into properly by department concerned.
Andrew Mitchell.
Mr. Speaker, on the Yemen-Saudi catastrophe that is taking place, Isn't it the case that Britain should move to a position of far greater neutrality, supporting a comprehensive ceasefire? And while Britain is absolutely right to condemn the Houthi attacks on Riyadh and Jeddah, should we not also condemn the night-after-night bombings by the Saudi aircraft, which are killing innocent civilians and radicalising tens of thousands of young Yemenis?
I say to my right honourable friend, we have called for a ceasefire. We've supported the efforts that have been made for a ceasefire. We've supported those efforts around Hodeidah, a very important port, obviously, for getting humanitarian relief in. But this is why it is so important that we continue to work with our international partners and with the UN Special Envoy to bring about that ceasefire, to enable the parties to come round the table, to get the political settlement, which is the only way to ensure the future security and stability of Yemen.
Kerry McCarthy.
On Friday, Mr. Speaker, a 14-year-old girl with autism and a learning disability was placed in a secure mental health unit 150 miles from home. Her mother's already had to stop work and her parents are now trying to scrape together the money to find temporary accommodation there so they can be near their child. Does the Prime Minister not agree that we really need decent, trusted facilities in every community for distressed children so that families don't have to go through this?
Well, the Honourable Lady makes a very important point, and obviously the emphasis that we are putting in the National Health Service on dealing with mental health and on improving the support that is available to mental health is a part of this. We are looking, and I held a round table looking at the outcomes of the review that we've had on the Mental Health Act, where exactly these sorts of issues about the type of circumstances in which people were being provided for was raised. And this is something that the NHS is looking at very carefully, and we are ensuring that there is funding available for further facilities to be provided.
Mary Robinson.
Mr. Speaker, this afternoon I will meet with my Cheadle constituents who have travelled down to Westminster as part of the Christian Aid climate change lobby. With her world-leading commitment to a net zero target by 2050, the Prime Minister has shown that we are already leading the way. As we leave the EU, will she also urge her successor to put the environment at the heart of the Brexit negotiations?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for raising this issue, and can I also congratulate those of her Cheadle constituents who are coming down to Westminster today to discuss this very important issue. We will. The government has made a major step, as she says, by legislating for net zero. I hope that the Labour efforts to stop this in the House of Lords will not be successful, so that we can actually ensure that that legislation is signed. And we will make every effort as we leave the European Union, working with our European partners and others, to ensure that we put this at the forefront of discussions and that the right approach is taken to it by countries around the world.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that the Prime Minister is slightly distracted by the intoxicating emotion of imminent freedom and release. But while she's still running the country, could she spare a thought for the 1.3 million FOMOs in our nation? FOMOs, of course, being pensioner households missing out. And the Prime Minister will be aware that today that excellent charity, Independent Age, are actually seeking to support the campaign for the 3.5 million unclaimed pensioner benefits, according to the DWP's own figures. Would my honourable friend, would the Prime Minister agree with me that this 3.5 million should not be left to fructify in the coffers of the Treasury, but should flow to the FOMOs?
Can I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, which was put with his normal and natural theatricality in the chamber. As he will have seen, the Chancellor of the Exchequer will actually have heard the question that he has put. Obviously, we want to ensure that people who are entitled to benefits actually are in receipt of those benefits. But I would also say to the honourable gentleman that this government can be proud of the record of what we have done for pensioners through the triple lock and various other ways, such that pensioners are £1,600 a year better off under this government.
Sir John Hayes.
Mr. Speaker, today's mass lobby is about sustainability, but there can be no economic health nor communal well-being while soulless supermarkets make places ubiquitous whilst exploiting my Lincolnshire farmers and growers, and while heartless internet giants crush their small competitors. So will the Prime Minister use the tax system to redistribute power away from those heartless, soulless corporate monoliths to all that is small and eclectic and local and particular. For, Mr Speaker, as you know, Schumacher said, small is beautiful.
Can I say to my right honourable friend, he makes an important point about the importance of small businesses, the importance of local independent shops on our high street. We want to see those businesses supported. That is why, of course, we have taken steps already, for example, in relation to business rates. It's also why, for those who are concerned about the internet and the way the internet is being used to undermine some of those small businesses in terms of the retail environment, we are, of course, taking action in relation to those digital companies.
Evident code.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. While the Conservative Party leadership candidates tour the country offering unicorns, the Prime Minister may be thinking about her legacy. Will the Prime Minister please listen and act on the entirely reasonable demands of all those affected by Grenfell-related issues and finally commit to fund retrofitting of sprinklers on all residential buildings and others where vulnerable people live or work, give clarity on installation and upkeep of external building insulation, adequately fund our fire and rescue services and set up a social housing regulator with teeth? The public may thank you for it.
That's right. Can I say to the Honourable Lady, obviously, we are looking across the board. There's a number of issues that have been raised as a result of the terrible tragedy that occurred at Grenfell Tower, which we have already acted on, and we are continuing to work, as I said, indicated in response to her right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, last week. We are looking at issues such as social housing. I think one of while many people focus on the issue of cladding and the building standards, actually it was the fact that the people's voices were not being heard from that social housing. That is a particular concern, and ensuring we have the right approach in relation to regulation there is important. And on sprinklers, the recommendation after Lacanau was not that every property over a certain height should have sprinklers retrofitted, and it is important to be clear about that.
Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On the 15th of May, my right honourable friend welcomed a decision by NICE to allow the drug Spinraza, which is for spinal muscular atrophy, to be prescribed, including, we thought, to my constituent, the grandson of Mrs Ogborne. NICE has now written to Mrs Ogborne to say that they accept that the news story that appeared on the NICE website was not clear enough. That is code for saying my constituent's grandson will not receive this drug. When NICE says something, can it be ensured that it does it, and that bureaucratic flannel does not raise people's hope, then to dash it?
Can I say to my honourable friend, I'm very concerned to hear the case that he has brought before the House of his constituent, and in relation to Spinraza, I will ensure that this is looked into. If NICE says that Spinraza is available, then obviously it should stand by its word.
If the honourable gentleman doesn't get a result and he wants it to be debated again before the summer recess, let me tell him, it will be debated. He can be quite certain of that. Tony Antoniazzi.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In a recently aired BBC Scotland documentary on medical cannabis, the chair of the BPNA, Finbar O'Callaghan, said that the NHS will not pay for life-changing medical cannabis for epileptic children by saying, even if you prescribe the product, the NHS isn't going to pay for it. Is his statement correct, Prime Minister?
I've answered questions on this in the past, including, I think, from the Honourable Lady. The Government has changed the law. Specialist doctors on the General Medical Council's Specialist Register can now prescribe cannabis-based products for medicinal use where there is clinical evidence of benefit. And NHS England and the Chief Medical Officer have made it clear that cannabis-based products can be prescribed for medicinal use in appropriate cases. But obviously we need to trust doctors to make clinical decisions in the best interests of patients.
Alex Shelbrooke.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, on Thursday I was able, in the adjournment debate, to describe the barbaric treatment that my father-in-law received at a clinic in Barbados that ultimately led to his death. Mr Speaker, it shows the influence of this chamber that I've been contacted by many people from around the country who now want to talk to me about similar issues. And this morning, Mr Speaker, I've been contacted by a resident of Barbados who has said to me that actually the practices that go on in this clinic by Dr Alfred Sparman are far more horrific than we would recognise. May I ask my right honourable friend if she'd either meet with me or the relevant department of government so that I may inquire as to how we can work with Barbadian authorities to shut this man down and make sure that what happened to my father-in-law cannot happen to any other citizen.
Well, can I say to my honourable friend, I remember the conversation he and I had when this happened in relation to his father-in-law and the obviously terrible tragedy that took place. I will certainly ensure that the proper department is able to ministers from the proper department are able to sit down with him and explore the issue that he has raised.
Thank you. Marion Fellows.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Figures released today show there are currently £973 million worth of arrears owed under the Child Maintenance Service. And while new enforcement powers are welcome, CMS's bark continues to be worse than its bite. The UK Government must crack down on non-payment of maintenance to children and do it now.
Yep.
Will the Prime Minister agree to launch a full root and branch review of CMS to ensure a new strategy where maintenance payments are properly enforced and to lift these children who in many cases, well, are in poverty because of lack of maintenance payments?
The Honourable Lady is right that we want to ensure that those maintenance payments are indeed made for those children, that people, normally it's fathers, but it can in some cases be mothers, but that they take their responsibilities seriously and recognise their responsibilities. This is a difficult area. For many years, efforts have been made by different governments to ensure that we get this right and that we ensure that those maintenance payments are made. I'm sure every member of this House has had constituency cases in relation to this issue. The simplified system that was brought in recent years, I think, has been working better than the previous system, but I'll ensure that the department, the relevant department, looks at the issue she's raised.
How fun?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In Harlow, my constituency, many horses and ponies are tied up and tethered by the roadside, maltreated, put in dangerous locations, often without access to food and water. Will the Prime Minister work to end the suffering of these beautiful animals and amend the current outdated Animal Welfare Act and Code of Practice for the welfare of horses so that it clarifies what the government's powers are and what the duties of local authorities to intervene? And will she urge the RSPCA to treat this as a major concern?
Well, I think the Honourable Gentleman has raised an issue which is important. I will certainly ensure that the Department looks at the issue that he's raised about the definitions in the legislation, and I would hope that the RSPCA would take this seriously, as seriously as they take the ill treatment of other animals.
Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Last week, a brain tumour ended the life of Sarah Wands from Markinch in my constituency. Sarah was 44 years old, a brilliantly gifted young mathematician and statistician, tiny in physical stature, but a towering giant if measured by any qualities that matter. Does the Prime Minister share my hope that funding for brain tumour research will be increased to bring forward the day that other families are not affected as the Wands family have been?
Can I say to the Honourable Gentleman, obviously he's raised a very, very sad case, and a life that was full of, from what he says, was full of great promise has been sadly cut short. And our thoughts and prayers are with the family of the individual concerned. We have been putting more money into research in relation to brain tumours. This is an important area. It is one on which my right honourable friend, the former Health Secretary, started some extra work being done within the NHS. That is continuing. But he's raised a very important issue, and, as I say, our thoughts and prayers are with all those affected by this case.
Gillian Keegan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. 1 in 2 people in the UK now develop cancer at some point in their lifetimes, and around 60% of them will require radiotherapy as part of their treatment. In West Sussex, we don't have a single Linux machine, meaning my constituents travel long distances every day for treatment, and it's not only costly, but of course is gruelling when you are feeling so unwell. Can the Prime Minister outline what steps the Government is taking to ensure my constituents have the same access to medical care as others in adjacent counties?
Well, I fully recognise the concern that the Honourable Lady has raised. Of course, looking at how we deal with cancer, how we treat cancer, is one of the issues in the NHS long-term plan, which the NHS is putting a focus on. I recognise the concern for those who have to travel long distances to receive this treatment. As my honourable friend has said, it's not just often expensive for them, but it is difficult for them and gruelling for them in their obviously at the in the state of health that they are, and this is something that I think will be looked at as part of the future programmes for the NHS.
Finally, Mr. Nigel Dodds. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister will be aware, as indeed the whole House will be, of the long-standing campaign for justice and compensation by victims of the Libyan-sponsored IRA terrorism in Northern Ireland, indeed throughout the UK. US citizens have been compensated by the Libyan authorities, but the UK citizens have not. There are £12 billion held frozen in frozen assets in the United Kingdom. £17 million has been recovered in tax on that money in the last 3 years. Will she undertake to use that money to help the victims and ensure the special representative who has been appointed will work closely with the victims to obtain the justice that those victims rightly deserve?
The right honourable gentleman is absolutely right in raising the issue of the justice that these victims deserve. The issue he's raised is one that I have raised myself with the Libyan government in the past. I will certainly ensure that the special representative is able to make every effort to ensure that the victims get that to which they are entitled, and that he does work with the victims in doing that. It's important that their voice is an absolutely crucial part of this.
Order. Just before we come to the point of order, there's a very small number of announcements to make, the first of which draws upon and indirectly relates to something the Prime Minister said by way of expression of good wishes to the England female football team. I think that the House would want to know of the activities of the women's parliamentary football team, which are regularly communicated to me, not least because I am the president of the said team. I hope the whole House will wish to join me in wishing the women's parliamentary football team well at the weekend in its Guinness World Record attempt for the number of female footballers playing a game. This initiative being undertaken in collaboration with Equal Playing Field, whose mission is to challenge inequality in sport, particularly for girls and women globally. Secondly, I remind the House that today marks the 40th anniversary of the House's decision to endorse the proposal from Norman St John Stevas, an extremely distinguished leader of this House, to establish the system of departmental select committees. Since that momentous decision on the 26th of June 1979, those committees have grown and developed into a key, I might almost be tempted to say the key means by which the House holds ministers to account in detail for their conduct of government. I hope colleagues will agree it's a decision that we should all celebrate. And finally, as I know there is very widespread concern in this House on the matter of human rights, I hope colleagues will be pleased later to welcome to our proceedings, indeed I think he can be welcomed now, the Sikyong of the Central Tibetan Administration, Lobsang Sangay, who's been here before and he's here again. He represents in a very important way the people of Tibet. We identify with you, sir. It's a pleasure to see you again, and I think colleagues will feel that way, and I'm looking forward to seeing you later today. Please continue your good and important work, even in the face of very considerable pressures. Point of order, Liz Saville Roberts.
Diolch yn fawr iawn. Mr Speaker, on Monday I received a letter from the Chief Whip confirming an intention to move the writ for the Brecon and Radnorshire by-election on Tuesday the 25th of June. Yesterday came and went, but no writ was moved. It was claimed that there was an issue with Powys Council and specifically the returning officer that was delaying the process. Powys Council confirmed within a matter of hours that this was not the case, and they themselves, Powys Council, were waiting for the writ to be moved. ITV Wales's political editor, Adrian Masters, has speculated that the government has not moved the writ for the Brecon and Radnorshire by-election, not because of problems in Powys, but because they couldn't guarantee that Powys would not, as is their right, hold an election on the 25th of July. The 25th of July being, of course, the first full day of the new Prime Minister's premiership. Now, Mr. Speaker, could you confirm to me whether you have had notification that the government intends to move the writ today or continue to miss their own deadline and make highly questionable excuses for delaying the blushes of a new Prime Minister by delaying moving the writ?
The Honourable Lady for her point of order, and to her for giving me notice of it. I was advised yesterday that the plan to move the writ yesterday had been aborted. Instead, the intention, I was advised at that stage, approximately 24 hours ago, would be to move the writ today. However, I was informed earlier that the writ would not be moved today. If the Honourable Lady is asking me, the Chair, whether I am clear as to when the writ will be moved, the honest answer is that I am not aware. It is certainly regrettable for the Right Honourable Lady to have received information privately which transpired not to be borne out by events. If she was given to understand that it would be moved and it wasn't, and it indeed has not been, that is regrettable. I suggest that her best recourse is directly to approach the Government Chief Whip on this matter. Thank you. Yes, indeed. A point of order, Mr. Richard Graham.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Many of us here have visited Richard Ratcliffe, now in his 12th day of a hunger strike in support of his wife Nazanin, wrongly in jail in Tehran, and the number of messages, flowers and visitors show that this House and this country is strongly in sympathy of the Radcliffe family's long ordeal. Is there anything that you can do, sir, to spread the word that other members visiting him would be extremely welcome?
I agree with the honourable gentleman. I think it would be very welcome if members had time and felt inclined to visit Richard Ratcliffe. You know, I'm not in the business of announcing my travel plans, and the honourable gentleman wouldn't expect me to do so. But I have heard what he said, and I have my own thoughts on that matter. And I think I've indicated that I think it a very good idea, and it would be very welcome if members from across the House, simply as human beings to another human being, felt inclined to demonstrate solidarity and support. I agree unreservedly with the honourable gentleman, and I rather imagine I shall be having another conversation with him at a later date to tell him more. Yes, indeed. Point of order, Geraint Davis.
Speaker, you know people travel far and wide to go into the Prime Minister's question time. I today have got the Imam from the University Mosque, Sheikh Mossim, and his colleague Mahabub Bashir here today. And I was wondering, given people have to travel so far and the public and private travel networks aren't that great, whether you might consider in the future the possibility of delaying the start time of PMQs to enable more people to travel from further afield to view these proceedings.
Well, that's an ingenious idea. I'm not sure if it were a divisible proposition before the House that it would necessarily command a majority. The reason why I say that is that I noticed some furrowed brows at the suggestion that we should start late. We often start late anyway, because I am keen to ensure that backbenchers have a full opportunity at the previous session. Moreover, the honourable gentleman is a discerning and observant fellow, and I feel sure that he will have noticed that I often also allow a very full opportunity for backbenchers at Prime Minister's questions. So I suppose what I would say is, even if someone is a bit late for Prime Minister's questions, there's quite a good chance that they'll still witness a goodly proportion of it. So I will reflect on the honourable gentleman's idea, but I would say to him that he shouldn't ring me, and I can't guarantee to ring him. Point of order, Mr. Robert Courts.
Mr. Speaker, I'm always troubled when I hear any allegation of bad faith in this chamber. And today we've heard an allegation of an honourable member having made, I think, a career out of lying. Would you guide me, please, on whether it is in order for honourable members to accuse others of lying?
I didn't hear any allegation of dishonesty. I didn't hear that. If there was an allegation of dishonesty, I didn't hear it. I heard another word used which I don't think was particularly tasteful, but which I did not judge to be disorderly. But what I would say to the honourable gentleman, apart from obviously that I can rule only on that which I hear there and then, and there was a great deal of noise in the chamber, is this. If there is to be an allegation of dishonesty against a member, that allegation should be made on a substantive motion. That is the long-established procedure in this House. It should not otherwise be done. And I've given an answer. If the honourable gentleman's point of order is on the same matter, it's on a completely unrelated, totally unrelated matter. Very well, I'm happy to hear it, but that's the answer to the honourable gentleman. Such allegations should be made on substantive motions and not otherwise. That's the answer. And as far as each individual situation is concerned, then obviously the Chair has to deal with the circumstances as he, or in the case of one or other of my deputies, she finds those circumstances. Point of order, James Heapy.
Thank you very much, sir. On Monday, we passed legislation setting net zero as our target for decarbonisation by 2050. It's a hugely important thing to have done, and our constituents are very interested in the matter. Mr. Speaker, you've done great things to make the proceedings of this House more intelligible to the public beyond, and websites like They Work For You have done likewise. Yet because there was no division on Monday, the unanimous support of that legislation will go unrecorded by They Work For You. At a time when the public think our politics is hopelessly divided, I wonder if you agree that at moments when the House is unanimous for its support in legislation like that, They Work For You should record those matters, not just the occasions on which we disagree.
Well, we're not responsible here, and the Chair is certainly not responsible for the modus operandi of They Work For You. If memory serves me correctly, there will have been wording at the bottom, at the end of the debate, saying that the question was agreed to, which I think is itself revealing. I agree with the honourable gentleman that it is a pity, to put it no more strongly, if a situation of consensus within the House is not regarded as noteworthy. I think it is noteworthy. I don't have an immediate solution, but knowing the perspicacity, indeed the indefatigability of the honourable gentleman, I feel sure that he will now beetle back to his office and pen a note, or better still, send an email to They Work For You, drawing attention to his efforts in the chamber and imploring them to up their game. Thank you. If there are no further points of order, we come now to the presentation of the bill in the name of Secretary Michael Gove. The Minister nods. Well done.
Animal Welfare Sentencing Bill.
Second reading what day? Tomorrow. Thank you. Order. We come now to the 10-minute rule motion. Christian Matheson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to establish an independent regulator for football clubs and for related purposes. On March the 9th this year, supporters of Blackpool FC went to watch a home match for the first time after a 4-year boycott of home fixtures. The reason for their protest was the mismanagement of the club as they saw it by its owners, Owen and Carl Oyston. Yet it was more than simply mismanagement. The fans believed that the Oystons had been bleeding the club dry, not just failing to invest, but taking large sums of money out. Indeed, a High Court judgment found that the Oystons had illegitimately stripped £26.77 million from the club. Previously, as Nick Harris reported in the Daily Mail, Mr Oyston Sr. was the highest paid person in English football, in the season when Blackpool were in the Premier League, 2010-11, receiving an eye-watering £11 million, with only Wayne Rooney reportedly coming close to similar remuneration. Yet there was nothing the supporters could do within the existing structures of the game to force a change of ownership and stop their club being ransacked. So, unable to prevent the mismanagement by the Oystons, the supporters had to take things into their own hands and eventually launched a boycott of home games to deny Blackpool's owners their money. They received support from fans of other clubs and from the national supporters' organisations, but little support from the football authorities. And to get to a point where the club is now being sold, it has taken 4 years of not doing the one thing that binds them together and defines them, watching the football team they love. If this was a one-off, I'd feel sorry for Blackpool fans, pleased they've almost won their campaign, and move on. But it isn't. Coventry City fans are in an even worse situation. Who can forget the 1987 Cup final with players like Mickey Ginn and Brian Kilcline, Keith Houchin, Steve Ogrizovic and manager John Sillett dancing on the Wembley turf with the FA Cup? Yet this once proud club is being driven into the ground by its owners, Sisu. Sisu is an investment firm based offshore and its ultimate owners are not clear. Once again, Coventry City have had to find ground-sharing options some 18 miles away from Coventry at Birmingham City, as the legal wrangle continues between Sisu, Wasps Rugby Union and Coventry City Council. Yet Sisu are answerable to no one, and indeed, according to the Coventry Telegraph, made no public statement between 2016 and March of this year. Further up the M6, Mr Deputy Speaker, Bolton Wanderers, again one of the great names in English football, are now in administration and are being so badly managed that staff have not been paid and other clubs are assisting with payroll and even providing food banks to support employees. I recall going to the old Burnden Park in 1994, Mr Deputy Speaker, to watch Everton play against Bolton in the FA Cup and meeting the great Nat Lofthouse. How can the club of the Lion of Vienna now be resorting to food banks as it is run into the ground? This is not a recent phenomenon. In 1997, the owner of Brighton and Hove Albion closed the old Goldstone ground without any alternative provision being made so that he could sell off the site and make millions from property development. My own hometown club, formerly Chester City FC, was driven into the ground by a succession of owners who used it either as a tax-dodging scheme or, in one case, it has been alleged, as a front for laundering ill-gotten gains from criminal activity. The club dissolved and was reborn as a fan-owned club, which has been challenging at times, but those challenges have never included deliberately running down the club and siphoning off cash. The concern for supporters is that they're only ever one bad owner away from these types of problems, and that they have nowhere to turn for help. The FA and the leagues have an owners and directors test, but these might only be relevant in the case of, for example, previous criminal convictions. But a group like Sisu can turn up at Coventry and bleed the club dry with no intention of investing in its future, and the FA can do nothing. These are just a few examples of clubs with question marks over the way they are being or have been run. You can currently add to that list Notts County, Gateshead, Bury, and my honourable friend from Bury North was petitioning the High Court last week on behalf of the supporters in his constituency. In the recent past, Portsmouth, Hartlepool, Charlton Athletic and more. Too many to be isolated cases, suggesting that there is a broader problem that needs to be addressed. When I was on the DCMS Select Committee, I raised this with Greg Clark, the chairman of the FA, a decent man who I believe genuinely wants to do his best for football. I asked if there was nothing the FA could do about unscrupulous owners. Mr Clark replied that they can look into the backgrounds of potential owners. He was referring to the owners and directors test. But he could not do anything about a person who was simply bad at running a football club. The FA has devolved such matters to the leagues, but the leagues are membership organisations, and any rules or regulations have to be voted in by their own members, those very same owners of clubs. The worst sanction is a points deduction for going into administration, but that is hardly relevant in the cases described above. Football needs independent regulation, that is, regulation independent of the owners who have a vested interest. The making of rules or regulations about football clubs and decisions on their application should not be the task of the professional football clubs or the people who own and manage them. That regulation could and should be done by the Football Association in the interest of the game as a whole. A regulatory body under the auspices of the FA, adequately funded and suitably staffed, with effective regulations and the power to enforce them, could restore faith in the running of the game. Of course, there are ways in which the owners and directors test can be improved, but it will never be foolproof. Not all bad owners start out bad. A regulator could be there to educate and advise and support. Punishment and sanctions should be the last resort, and the good owners should have nothing to fear. they should be benefiting from reflective improvements across the game. This bill would bring into being an independent regulator with the powers to undertake independent and forensic audits of clubs' directors and financial activities where sufficient concern has been expressed as to the management of the club, and to report to the FA with the recommendations for action or to address any deliberate financial mismanagement. Or, of course, to decide there's no case for further action. There would be limits. I remember, for example, going to the Valley in November 1998 to watch Everton play Charlton. As I arrived there, I was horrified to learn that the Everton chairman, Peter Johnson, had just sold our totemic striker Duncan Ferguson to Newcastle behind the back of the manager. I wanted Johnson out. But one bad decision such as this wouldn't necessarily require independent scrutiny. I'm concerned with consistent behaviour to run a club into the ground. Similarly, I recall one previous owner of Chester City, an American, who sacked the manager and started to pick the team himself. That's bad management as referred to by Greg Clark, but it's not destructive management, using the club for nefarious means, and would not on its own likely fall under the scope of the regulator described in this bill. Ideally, it would be for the Football Association that would undertake these activities, but in the absence of action, an independent regulator is needed so that the scandals of Brighton and Blackpool and Coventry and Chester City are a thing of the past, and the supporters have somewhere to turn to in their desperation. Perhaps now the Football Association would take the opportunity to consider bringing forward proposals of their own to address this problem, and I urge them to consider the suggestions of the Football Supporters Association, whom I have consulted closely in preparing this bill. Because while the directors of a football club may be the legal owners, they are surely only the custodians on behalf of the whole family of supporters of each club. If they are unable to act in the best interests of the club and the team, and are seen to be acting in their own interests to the detriment of the club, that cannot be allowed. Mr Deputy Speaker, if I don't like Tesco's, I can go to Sainsbury's. If I'm still unhappy, I can go to Asda or Waitrose or Aldi or Lidl. But you can't do that with a football team. Football supporters have a profound sense of loyalty and identity and belonging to a club which can't be transferred at the first sign of trouble. In my case, I'm the fourth generation of my family to support Everton. I was born into that tradition. You can't manufacture it. And most supporters with their clubs would say exactly the same. And football's a great unifier, bringing the nation, and this applies equally to all four home nations, together in great moments of national unity, as well as something that we can talk about to complete strangers and bond over in the pub or by the coffee machine. And that's why, when we have so many other critical issues to consider in this House at the moment, this bill is important. Because football matters to so many people. And at a time when our country is so divided, then in common with all sports, but perhaps more than any other sport, it can bring our country together again. When fans such as those of Blackpool or Coventry or Bolton Wanderers are treated so abysmally as they have been, whilst their owners bleed the clubs dry, there has to be a mechanism for giving them an outlet to redress their grievances, because at the moment they have nowhere to go. I would prefer the Football Association to do this, and I hope they will do so. But if they can't, then we must support the supporters with a tough and independent regulator. This bill does that, and I commend it to the House.
The honourable member have to leave to bring in the bill. The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare to bring in the bill?
Damien Collins, Mr Marcus Jones, Mr Jim Cunningham, Colleen Fletcher, Gordon Marsden, Joe Stevens, Alison McGovern, Justin Madders, Ian Mearns, Chion Wara, Chris Eaton-Harris and myself, sir.
Christian Matheson. Marvellous.
Football Regulation Bill.
Second reading what day?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Well done, Chris. We now come to the Opposition Day motion in the name of the Leader of the Scottish National